This is a huge moment for the HR industry, and I am hearing absolutely nothing. I think this will be the only podcast that is ever produced about this, asking any of these questions, because they just do not want to look at it. We created the DEI hire. I've been talking about it, 2024, 2025. Still, people were saying it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. It's not fine. I'm at a vigil where people are, talking about lynching and putting targets on journalists' backs. It's not fine. Welcome to This Isn't Working, the podcast for employers and employees who think it's time to talk about the failings of workplace culture and how we can do better. I'm your host, Tanya de Grunwald, an HR commentator who's watching, listening, and hopefully asking the right questions. Okay, let's get this working. Hi, everybody. So today we're talking about Jason Arday, and I know this story has received a lot of coverage and commentary in the last few weeks, both before his death and since. But one place I can assure you it has received almost no coverage or attention is in the UK's HR industry, where I have to say it's been complete tumbleweed. This is a huge DEI story, which means it should be a huge HR story. So I'm asking, where is the commentary? Who is asking the questions? Is anyone reflecting on what went wrong here from an HR perspective? Because if they are, I have not seen it. I have a lot of thoughts, and I'm also feeling a lot of feelings. So I've invited my psychotherapist friend. That's my friend who's a psychotherapist, not my psychotherapist. Although maybe she's going to dial in as well, depending on how this goes. Jaco van Zyl is here to explain to us a bit about what he thinks is going on here in terms of the somewhat tribal reaction that we're seeing to this rather strange story, which continues to unfold. And obviously, because we're an HR-focused podcast, what all this means for employers who are paying attention. Thank you so much for joining me. So listen, let's start with where are we now? And maybe, I've got a lot of thoughts, as I said, but maybe you could just give us a snapshot of where you are with this, given your kind of psychotherapy lens, why you think this moment is so significant for us as a society and on an individual level, and what this tells us, particularly including employers, about where we are.
It's a bit of a reckoning, isn't it? It's a reckoning. It's a train wreck. And when there's a train wreck, there's a reckoning. And I think this has started how long ago, when people decided it's a good idea when we judge individuals according to token designations, according to group identity, and to preemptively assign innocence, lack of agency, vulnerability to individuals as if they were babes based on group identity, and to assign perpetration, oppression, aggression, malice to people, to the other group identity according to, say, race or gender, whatever they call sex. Let's use that word instead. And when whole corporates go along with this wrong-headed, philosophically inferior way of dealing with people, and wholeheartedly participate in a kind of social engineering, it is only a matter of time until there is going to be a reckoning. And this is where we're at. And instead of learning our lesson, some people want to hunker down. Some people want to hunker down and want to increase the obsession with identity markers. So certain people are just not prepared to learn their lesson, are they?
So were you surprised by what we've seen, either as the story began to unfold, and we had this academic who was in this very prestigious role, and more questions suddenly began to emerge, whatever you think of the reasons why they began to emerge or the original sources for that? It seemed like an awful lot of questions were emerging about whether his experience and his personal story actually stacked up under scrutiny. What happened next was an awful lot of media pressure, media attention on him. Rightly or wrongly, that was what happened. He clearly felt under pressure, and it seems that he took his own life at that point. And since that, we've seen a reaction to that. I think the story as it was unfolding, actually, before his death, I didn't see very much on LinkedIn, for example. It seemed to me like there was a sort of shock People would seem to be frozen in shock. People that I would normally see talking about all this stuff actually went fairly quiet. And I think it was because there were some really awkward questions emerging before he died. Once he died, I feel the tone shifted massively and immediately. His death was announced in the evening. I think it was around 7 or 8 o'clock at night. And by the time I got home and checked my phone at like 11ish, my feed was full of all this stuff and it seemed to have completely wiped everything we'd heard about the questions about his experience and his story. And now he was presented as being a totally different character that, frankly, I didn't recognize. He was an angel. He was seemingly a genius. He was also almost, I think, a prophet. I think there was something very religious about what we're seeing now. And I went to the vigil in Trafalgar Square on Monday evening. And I have to say, I stood there with all these people, and there are claims by the organisers that there was up to 30,000 people there. I think I was there with people that go to lots of these things, and they said they thought it was more like 5 to 15,000, which sounded much more likely. But I have to say, I found the whole thing very disturbing and upsetting.
The hundreds and thousands of people in the UK and around the world who are appalled by the public assassination of Jason Arday. The lynching. The lynching.
And as I looked around the crowd, and you will have seen something different in the footage that you saw, but as I looked around the crowd and I saw people uncritically accepting this narrative that the evil British establishment, the media, but also the universities, had hounded this gifted, sensitive prophet to death, I saw something very spiritual in that crowd. And I go to quite a lot of events where I end up finding that, whether it's the Stonewall Conference or the Reform Conference or any of these things that I go to, I see the same sense of spiritual coming together. But the question that I had was, how responsible is HR for this? And the reason I'm asking that is because I think what I saw, this blame game, is what happens when the public has lost faith in standards and processes and meritocratic hiring and promotion. That's what I saw. You probably saw something different in that crowd. What did you see when you saw that footage?
No, I would say that I saw something similar to what you just described, and it's very understandable. When crowd formation starts happening or mass formation starts happening, we tend to lose reality contact, and we tend to regress or resort to superordinate narratives, to doctrine. And many times these doctrines feel transcendental. It's very, very common where it comes to what we call narcissistic large group regression. So there is this sense of transcendentality, there is the sense of threat. It is us who are under threat. Those people or the others are a threatening party. And we need to do what is necessary to survive this threatening episode we find ourselves in. So what you described there is more or less what I saw myself. So we need to remind ourselves that DEI is built upon critical social justice, and there are a range of critical theories that add up to form critical social justice. So that is the ideology, but the ideology is also based upon a certain psychology, and the psychology is existential paranoia, and how we judge individuals according to groups and what those groups mean to us. You're either innocent or you're guilty, and what follows now is a form of justice. And right from the beginning, so you asked me, what do I make of this whole affair? I was like, right from the beginning, people found themselves in ideological stupor. When you see Hillary Kremen, how she swooned over this black messiah who walked in, and she embraced him, and he was going to be the savior of some sort.
And now Jason is days away from achieving another ambition.
Hey, so good to see you.
Here's his new boss at Cambridge.
There will be those that think this is a tokenistic appointment. What are your thoughts on this?
The board of electors on your interview day were absolutely unanimous. We are so lucky to have you. You are the best in the world in terms of the research that you do.
It's crazy making to see how immediately a person's critical faculties have been suspended, and people have this devotional allegiance to the paranoid doctrine. And right from the beginning, that gave him the opportunity to then run with it. So we need to keep in mind that these were all individuals who have agency. These were not babes. They were not infants. These were grown-ups. But because of their commitment to a doctrine, their critical faculties rendered them impervious to reality contact. And because of that, a whole series of bad decisions were made, and everybody participated in it. Cambridge participated in it. Cambridge HR participated in it. Hillary Clement participated in it. And of course, the man, the adult, who's now being Floydified, who's now being divinized, who's receiving his apotheosis, Jason Arday, he also participated in this whole devious affair. It ended tragically. And everything, Tanya, everything could have been prevented. Everything could have been prevented if he was just humble enough to accept who he was than to have this grandiose idea about himself. If the system did not reward him for grandiosity, whether it was accurate or not. If people were just honest and adequately truth or reality perfected or had reliable reality contact, none of this would have happened. His wife would still have had a husband. I don't know if they're married. His children would still have had a father. None of this would have been this mess that it degraded into.
I think at the Vigil, it seemed very much that people were looking for someone to blame. There was a sense of looking not only for blame, but also for justice. And I have to say, for retribution. Some of those speeches I felt completely crossed the line. You know, they started off by saying this is a peaceful way to remember Jason, and it ended up, some of the stuff that was said, I just thought was pretty scary. It was pretty scary about journalists as well. And I was there with some journalists, and I consider myself a journalist. Maybe I'm more of a commentator these days. I'm probably more sympathetic with the press than many people are with a background in journalism. But I think, you know, they were basically saying, you know, they were telling journalists that they shouldn't have done their job and that they overstepped. I think that whole thing got out of control, but I thought it was really frightening that's the territory that they're into.
And I want in particular to talk about the role that I believe the vicious media campaign drove him to his death.
What I saw, I mean, this isn't a journalism podcast, this is an HR podcast, but I just felt that all the blame was being directed that evening at that vigil. It was all being directed at journalists who frankly had done a good job, I think, on balance. This was I can see this story had something for everybody, basically, didn't it? It had something for everybody, and it was the kind of thing people were chatting about in pubs. But it was a story that had everything, but it also was exposing the mistakes that had been made and that there is merit to this idea of the DEI hire. And it's fascinating to see how far supposedly clever people, these super clever clogses at one of the most impressive universities in the world, supposedly had fallen for somebody who seems to have fabricated an awful lot of details. And that they were that for me, that was the interesting part as a non-academic, was there was kind of a I can't believe those geniuses got taken in by this guy. Like, so clearly this story doesn't add up. But I did feel that all the direction, all the blame seemed to be going on journalists and some towards Cambridge. But what I'm finding disturbing is that I have seen absolutely no reflection from anybody, any of the supposed leaders within DEI, and nothing within HR. So DEI is part of HR. If this is a huge DEI story, which I think it is also a huge HR story. And I think if this was a functioning, healthy industry, which I think we've pretty much just discovered and decided it isn't, I would be seeing loads of thoughtful think pieces about How did we get here as an industry? This is a reckoning moment. How did this idea of the DEI hire happen? How have people lost faith in hiring processes being fair? How have we got to this position where this story got completely out of control? And I don't see any, not only I see no accountability, I don't see any discussion at all. I think this video will be the only video that is ever made about HR. This will be the only coverage I think will ever be out there. And I've had this before where I've thought, maybe they're just waiting. Maybe they think it's too soon. And you wait and nothing happens. How many times there was no coverage about Kemi Badenoch's report on DEI, which was published in early 2024. I waited for the coverage in the HR press. It never came. I Googled before this call, how many articles do you think were written about Jason Arday in HR Magazine, Personnel Today, and People Management Magazine, which is the magazine of the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development, the CIPD? How many articles do you think would come up with Jason Arday's name in them? The answer is 1.
Oh, yeah, at least, yeah.
Personnel Today wrote something on the 7th of August that was before he died. That was it. Nothing else. Nothing from the CIPD. And the CIPD I want to come back to because I think they deserve an awful lot of the blame. I'm not going to blame them for his death because I think there's been enough houndings going on out there, and I'm very uncomfortable with that. You mentioned narcissistic large group regression. Can you just explain a bit more about what that means? Because that really, I don't know what that means, but it feels like something that is making sense.
Yeah, so narcissistic large group regression starts with our group identity. We all have group identities, okay? So that is normal. If someone shames you for having a group identity, they have issues. We all have group identities, but people also appreciate that different groups can be good and mutually respectful neighbors. When narcissistic means self-protective, large group referring to the large group you're identifying with, and it can be as a British citizen across racial lines, or it can be as a white person or a black person, it can be as a Muslim or a Christian. So that's a large group identification. So narcissistic, self-protective, large group, the group you're identifying with, regression. And that is the crucial part here, where people regress to primitive ways of thinking, particularly paranoid ways of thinking, in splits where I feel like I'm the target of aggression and an identified other group is the perpetrator. And because of that, I need to retaliate, like you said. I need to retaliate in some way so as to settle the scores. And in narcissistic large group regression, there's also this process called time collapse, where people recall historical events and they personalize historical events. And it's almost like they participate in fantasy in these historical events of humiliation, but also the drive towards victory, to regaining our respect. And wasn't it interesting? That is exactly what happened when some of those speakers were saying that Jason Arday was assassinated, and there was one speaker who said that he was lynched. So you can hear assassinated. Who in history was assassinated? I think of Martin Luther King Jr. who was assassinated, or who was lynched. You know, the dark history of America. So you see this time collapse, and they use history as a master narrative in the here and the now. None of those individuals of history are still alive. So these are character vacancies whom they now slot into using the population that's currently existing. So that means that people who are absolutely clueless, who've had no participation in historical injustices, are now being dragged into this time-collapsed imaginary conflict that the narcissistically regressed large group is now enacting. And that is why we heard so much about the demonization of white people, either directly or by implication, and the sacralization of Black people or people of color, and the call for retribution or retaliation. This is all psychological, Tanya. It has only selective reality contact, and they pick and choose what is necessary to fit into this larger narrative of narcissistic or of paranoid threat. When I've had experience of working with people, especially in the forensic domain, where a person may have lost reality contact, became paranoid, schizophrenic, and within that state of paranoia, committed vicious crimes and even committed murder. I've had several such cases in my career. We cannot downplay the severity of this. When a person starts, or even a group starts embodying a paranoid form of existence, they are eventually going to enact that and going to, while with their own minds, they are self-protective. They're defensively attacking, or they defensively murder what they observe around them. Eventually, that is the consequence if this large group regression continues unabated. And sadly, there's no reasoning with these people. Diane Abbott, everyone that was speaking there, there's no reasoning with these people because it is the narrative that prevails. It's no longer reality.
I actually found it really sad because I thought the people that were there, I think their pain is real. I think there was a deep sense of hurt and pain, and from their past, I think probably most people there had been through some kind of humiliating experience that was because of their race. I would have, big or small, I think that pain is real. I'm sure people have been through horrible stuff. I felt that that was being magnified by the speakers and being in a way that didn't feel helpful. I felt, from my perspective, I felt really sad because when I was working in this area at the time when some of these ideas were coming in, which, by the way, we did not call critical social justice. We thought we were expanding talent pools and, finding rough diamonds from interesting different backgrounds and bringing lots of different people in who've got lots of different ideas. It was good, that was where nobody was talking in those sorts of that sort of language, because we would have gone, that's weird, that's got nothing to do with the workplace. It wasn't dressed like that. When I started getting into this stuff, and I came into it via social mobility and particularly unpaid internships, most of us were really, really naive, and we turned up thinking we want to bring in lots of different people. Great. Lots of these organizations have looked and sounded the same for a really, really long time. It's getting a bit weird. We need to be more modern and more inclusive. That was kind of it. There wasn't an academic lens to it. Now I look back, and some of the people that I realized, even some of the people who I platformed myself through the work I was doing, I look at them now and I think that was an activist. I didn't realize that, but I can see from the content of that event that, we're capitalizing Black, we're talking about intersectionality, we're doing positionality, we're doing code switching, as if this is completely normal language. And that's what we're talking about. And I can see, and I wrote the reports after those events, and I have to say it's quite an uncomfortable read for me now. But I can also hear myself thinking I'm just being a nice middle-class white girl, just trying to get this stuff right. And it's not coming from, it's sort of not coming from this, I don't know, I just think DEI, people that don't understand DEI don't understand, because we didn't understand the academic history of it. I think other people don't understand that we didn't understand that. And that's not, we didn't buy all these ideas. We didn't say, oh, great, let's create this hyper-racialized lens in the workplace. That's going to go well. Of course, that was never going to go well, but that wasn't what we bought.
Yeah, it is a pity that everything, everyone need to be subjected to this doctrine of DEI. Everything gets subjected to doctrine. Everything. Even Jason Arday, was subjected. He was turned into political fodder. It is what it is. This is what CRT does. Even in psychology, that's the major scandal, even you're in psychology, where you need, according to CRT, according to woke psychotherapy or critical therapy, you turn your client or your patient into a political asset. Everything gets subjected to doctrine. And this is what you get. This is what you get. Your people are pawns to affect a specific kind of destructive revolution. Bottom line. That is the radix, that's the root, that's the origin of DEI. Everywhere, when you trace it back, that's the origin of DEI. Because Western civilization needs to be destroyed, and the best way of doing it is to guilt trip white people, to lionize minorities, and to ensure that some form of inversion and destruction takes care of the rest.
I think there's plenty of blame to go around, I have to say. I guess I just, I'm standing there in this crowd with all these people, and I think they are very confused. But these are my fellow Londoners. I'm a proper Londoner, and these people were proper Londoners too, I think. And out just of all the places that I saw, diversity and inclusion going, as I cheerfully turned up, helping companies to get some of this stuff right, or helping them to talk to each other about getting this stuff right in 2017, 2018. I did not think I was going to end up at a vigil where people are talking about lynching and people are talking about, basically retribution against the press. It was a really, really shocking moment. And there was a singer who sang that Coldplay song, Fix You, which I have to say is not particularly one of my favorites, but I did shed a little tear actually, because I was looking around at other people who were crying, and I just thought maybe I had my own stuff going on, but I just was like, I suddenly felt really emotional, thinking, how on earth did we get here? This is really, really sad. We've ended up dividing people. We've ended up confusing people. And I just come back to this question, which is, if people have lost, this is what happens, right? If people have lost trust in meritocratic hiring and promotion, and if that is what has happened here, which I think that's what's happened here, why has that happened? Who is responsible for that? And again, I don't want to get into hounding anybody. I think there's enough hounding going on as it is, but we as an industry that are involved with hiring and promotion, this should be a question. This is a huge, huge question for us. And this is a huge moment for the HR industry. And I am hearing absolutely nothing. I think this will be the only podcast that is ever produced about this, asking any of these questions, because they just do not want to look at it. There is no discussion. All of that has completely died. We created the DEI hire. This is a horrible phrase, which we have been allergic to, being like, oh, it's such a horrible phrase, such a horrible. We created that. And that phrase was created because the public lost trust that hiring was still meritocratic. But we didn't engage with it. We refused to engage with the critics who were raising concerns. And even worse, we actually dismissed them and added basically more soundproofing to the inside of our echo chamber. The number of these organizations which decided to come off X, for example, because they were so horrified by the toxic debate on there. Okay, X is pretty rough sometimes, but that toxic debate, in among that are some critics who are telling you stuff that you need to listen to. So removing yourself and going to sit on Blue Sky and LinkedIn, you're going to miss out on some of the criticism that, frankly, you need to be hearing and you need to be engaging with.
Precisely.
So that was
Groupthink.
that was clear to me by 2022. So actually, there's a picture of me holding up a picture of Suella Braverman, who was having a go at DEI, and that's at one of my events. I'm holding up, that's 2022. That event was the week before the Queen died. So this is going back some time. And I was raising it then. And everybody said, no, it's fine. No, it's fine. And I said, I don't think it is fine. People are raising questions about this. What are we going to do? And everyone said, it's fine. We're not going backwards. We're sticking with it. And they doubled down. I've been talking about it, 2024, 2025. Still, people were saying it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's not fine. I'm at a vigil where people are, talking about lynching and putting targets on journalists' backs. It's not fine.
Society and the systems that have taken centuries and centuries to build have become sources of exploitation. Instead of minding our systems, instead of taking care of our institutions, our social infrastructure. People are like, we can still play around with it. Is this a bad idea? Maybe, maybe not. This nihilistic, non-committal, this indifference to the social richness and social treasure that we've built up over centuries is one of the reasons why people let things go and play out the way it has. And that is why nobody is taking a stand to mind our social infrastructure. And now when a tragedy happens, now everybody wants to scurry around and wants to blame everyone else. I think this should be a call for serious introspection, to ask, how have you and I and your listeners, through your silence, through your complacency, through imagining that our social infrastructure is something to exploit, we'll just take the assaults on it? How have we participated in having bad ideas proliferate like termites, chewing away at our social foundation?
But to be fair, I think it has been extremely difficult to push back on
But
this.
But that is the thing. When you say, HR, this, that, and the other thing, and the thing I wrote down here is groupthink. And what guided this groupthink in many HR departments is this moral doctrine. And you dare not speak out against a moral doctrine because you'd be scapegoated. This intimidation is part of the strength of this vicious doctrine. And even just following this, so you can imagine a very wokeified university like Cambridge, and some of those HR personnel thinking, "Gosh, we're setting ourselves up for big trouble because this guy is playing us. He's gaming the system." But you dare not speak out. Do you think someone like Hillary Kremen would afford you a grain of mercy if you dared speak out against her little incarnated God in the form of Jason Arday? She would have pulled you to pieces. And so would some of her colleagues who also believed in this doctrine.
There were definitely signs that there were big problems here. I mean, there were successful discrimination cases beginning to happen, but they were not discussed very openly, and they were generally framed within the industry, I suppose, as kind of one-offs, or somebody got the process wrong. So there was an example with the RAF, there was an example with the police, and there was an example with a big advertising firm. But they weren't really properly discussed, and I think those were kind of oopsie kind of thing, and everybody just moved on. There were also big questions about positive action schemes, which may or may not have been lawful. So there's one going on with a company called 10,000 Black Interns at the moment. Possibly the name should have flagged that there might be something wrong with that company. So it's kind of sort of how close to the line are you prepared to get in order to up your numbers? And some of that stuff, the positive action, the law in the UK does allow for quite significant, what they call levelling the playing field, what the employers would call that. So you can do quite a lot of work to increase representation of underrepresented groups up to the point of selection, right? So there is quite a lot of stuff you can do lawfully. I think one of the mistakes they made was in thinking, well, it's lawful, so it must be ethical. It's lawful, so there can't be any other problems with it. What possible problem could there be if it's lawful? And of course, the problem is that people start to feel aggrieved, and it's not really fair that this group gets, say, extra confidence training, or, a special insights day, or they get to meet the bosses in advance of the selection process, and this group doesn't. How are you doing that? Are you sure that this group is sufficiently disadvantaged to allow for that? What if, and if it's done along the lines of race, I think you're in really, really dodgy territory there. It was also quite clear that practices were starting to creep. Broadly, we do not have quotas. They're not lawful here. But if we have targets, right? So but your targets will start to behave like quotas, particularly when you incentivize people to meet them, and also when you shame them for not meeting them. So not only are you attaching someone's bonus to them meeting these targets, but you're also saying, oh, we didn't meet your targets on race. That's not a great look, is it? So, of course, there were problems coming in there. But I think all of that, we should have been talking about all of that stuff. I think actually what happened was, we were doing the diversity and inclusion stuff had already kicked off. My first event that I did for Good and Fair Employers Club, which I was running at the time, was in spring 2018. It was all about diversity and inclusion, we called it. The equity bit came later. And so that was already underway. Of course, in 2020, with the death of George Floyd, everything just accelerated around race. And we were all encouraged to adopt this hyper-racialized lens. I heard people saying things like, if you don't see my race, you don't see me. And to somebody, to someone who was a child in the 80s and a teen in the 90s, to be honest, it did make some sense to me because I lived in a sort of colorblind kind of world, but there's nothing wrong with my eyeballs. I can tell if somebody's black. I'm looking straight at them. Like, why was it almost a bit weird that we weren't allowed to talk about it? So it did make sense.
Sorry, it's a loaded statement. If you don't see my race, what does it mean to see a person's race? That's an invitation to walk into such a big trap, because seeing race could also mean, okay, so you're racist after all, or no, I don't see race, or your race doesn't exhaust you as a person. Oh, so you want to deny my race? These people are so devious because they have an aim. Like I said, maybe it's just my suspicion, but I think by now the evidence is in, especially if you track like I said, the original writers of DEI and the critical social justice literature.
The person that said that to me was not a DEI activist, was not a DEI trainer. They're actually in a completely different role that had nothing to do with that. I didn't recognize this person as an activist. I thought this person was just a nice, sensible, happened to be black lecturer who understood this space better than I did. What do I know? I'm a blonde from London. What do I know? I had a nice start in life.
Packaging is everything.
So I had no reason to doubt this person. This person seemed completely sincere, and I totally bought it. And I didn't realize how dangerous that hyper-racialized lens was going to be.
Precisely.
I think a lot of people in my position, looking at this stuff so many years on, you see it completely differently. But I don't think it's fair to say that everybody who's been working in this field for this long had completely lost their marbles. I think a lot of people have. But there was something, and I must just say this, it would be dishonest if I didn't say this. There is something specific about Blackness as opposed to any other race, which is considered sacred. And I think, and that's the word that's in Eric Kaufman's title of his book, isn't it? Taboo. He's talking about how making race sacred. And I would say it's very specifically about being black. And I saw it at the Vigil as well. This is it was elevation.
Black brothers and kings in the audience. Repeat after me, black kings and black brothers. I am great. I am smart. I am loved. I am great. I am smart. I am loved.
And it creates a sense that this cannot be scrutinized, it cannot be questioned. There's certainly an identity crisis going on within this community, reckoning with the history, with the present day. We're talking about reparations. Are we moving forward or are we moving backwards? There seems to be a real tension there. And in doing preparation for this call, because I'm conscious that, I'm a posh blonde and you're a white South African. So I was like, this is going to be a great talk about race.
From the farm.
But I have actually talked to, several black friends and associates who I know about this. And they had some really interesting points to make about how the worst thing that they thought about DEI was that it never actually encouraged a broad breadth of views and perspectives from the so-called black community, which they don't feel really exists anyway. So black people, they just didn't, lots of those people with probably more socially conservative views were never consulted. They never liked this victim narrative.
Yeah.
They thought it was really, it's so insulting to be given a job because you didn't deserve it. They hated that. We didn't hear any of that. Those voices did not come up. And I don't know who's to blame for that. How would we know? We just took it all at face value. A bit like with the LGBT stuff, the sensible people go quiet and it leaves the other people to grab the mic and push their way through and insist to the other groups that they represent their entire group, and they don't. And I think that's a large part of why we're here as well.
It is such a relief when you encounter sensible Black and Indian and non-white people.
There are loads of them.
So many of them.
They're just not about Vigil.
I know, and they have so much self-respect and dignity that they do not want to participate in this nonsense. The same with LGB. I'm a married gay man. I mean, to be participating in this level of identity politics is crazy making, and we shouldn't stand for it. We shouldn't settle for it.
So let's talk about. I think one of the big issues for me is these are quite clearly quite bad, quite flawed ideas that were coming in, and it was quite clear that they were quite bad and quite flawed, I think, quite early on. So there's this issue about why there wasn't more discussion across HR, and in fact, even more broadly than HR, but across business. It should have been there years ago about the fact that DEI had massive flaws, and particularly, I think, was always going to be divisive around race, particularly. So people don't talk about the McKinsey reports enough. So huge management consulting firm who produced 4 reports about how demographic diversity, particularly sex and race, is good for business. Basically, it increases your profits, increases productivity, and therefore increases profits. Now, I've had Alex Edmonds on the podcast, and he's spoken at one of my This Is Working events, and it now becomes clear. Well, it was clear quite some time ago, in his view, that data is not only flimsy but non-existent. And they were pushing so McKinsey, who, guess what, sell services that will help you to improve your diversity. They were basically pushing these ideas, and McKinsey's extremely well regarded in the business world. They pushed not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 reports, all pushing that message. So you had, not only did you have the moral case, which I agree actually is more powerful emotionally, but you also had this supposed business case for diversity, particularly on race. And if there were any questions about the moral piece of it, then you were like, well, at least it's a good business case.
Precisely that.
So those two things were really reinforcing themselves. Now, there was also issues around big fears about race discrimination in the workplace, and employers getting into trouble and finding themselves at employment tribunals and needing to defend themselves. So what would help you to defend yourself if you found yourself in that position? They were told to buy DEI training around race, so that your whole workforce understood race and therefore was much less likely to do things like microaggressions, which could effectively see you in court. So it had a sort of, so it wasn't just that everyone just loved this stuff and thought it was great. But I think because there were no standards across these trainers, you had, who goes into that market? This massive market suddenly appears. It's really fashionable after 2020. This market appears and all these activists flooded into it. And there was no scrutiny. There were no standards. The CIPD, Chartered Institute of Personnel Development, had no standards around this whatsoever. So we ended up with a wild west of these people coming in who had some crazy ideas. And that was all the microaggression stuff, that was all the white privilege stuff, and that just got baked into policy and documents. But we were told there was a business reason for it. Now, even at that point, there were clearly problems with this. Why were we not discussing them?
Well, I'm just thinking about the audacity. The audacity to think that we can do whatever we think is just fine. Society will handle it. It will work out. Either way, it will work out. The audacity to be playing with life, with people's lives like that, livelihood. The audacity to be playing with our social contract, to be playing with race relations like that. McKinsey. And man, don't we know about McKinsey. So I think you alluded to 2 things. First of all, social status. Social status was one of the major driving factors. This was a new social religion, and you showed your social righteousness by participating in this social religion. That's the first thing. The second thing was profit. If they said, this is very, very profitable, go for this, and oh, by the way, we offer our services, I mean, they played the tide, and they saw that this tide was in favor of a bad idea, going to have catastrophic consequences, whether they realize it or not. But I mean, some businesses are extremely unscrupulous when it comes to things like these. Either way, we'll be maximizing our profits along this social tide that we're currently playing with.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. There was, having been so rude about them, I'm actually going to stick up for them, because there was a lot of pressure from the culture on big brands, particularly at that point. So if you had some kind of scandal around race, or sex or any of that stuff, the first thing everybody would do would be like, oh, well, look at their board. It's all, straight white men. And it would make you look incredibly unfashionable. If you made a mistake around race, you would be absolutely hauled over the coals. Social media was really rough, and young people were particularly powering that. And there's the online activists are, when they set their mind to something, they will absolutely go for a brand. Now, that they don't represent everybody. Again, as always is the case, the loudest voices do not represent everybody. The quiet people might, the silent majority probably didn't think it was such a big deal, whatever it was, or didn't even hear about it. And suddenly you're putting a black square on your brand because you're told that everybody really, really wants you to. You just haven't heard from everyone that goes, oh, I'm not sure about this whole black square thing. Then they're not, you're not hearing from them. So I think there was a sort of hysteria that came with that, and a lot of brands, and I've heard that from Paul Sweeney, who's been on this podcast, and he was in very senior roles at that time.
What do you think would have happened if they hadn't done anything on DEI? Was there a fear for the reputation of the organisation? Because there was a lot of stuff about look at the board of Nike or whoever, they're all these white blokes. It did look bad.
Well, that was part of it, and I think in Unite's case in particular, there was a recognition that the customer base, which was completely Gen Z, Gen Alpha, were probably students were probably the most vocal about some of this stuff, and there was a recognition that we needed to be careful, I guess, in making sure we didn't alienate the young people that were the company's customer base. Yeah, it was a very curious thing. I think it wasn't there were some explicit targets, but also I think it went beyond that into a positive discrimination by stealth was my view on it, because it became very clear if you talked to any headhunters or any chairs of big companies that they basically felt they couldn't hire any more white middle-aged men, regardless of their competence or skills. They just couldn't be seen to do it. It was too politically dangerous for them.
I think it's incredible what he was saying about, really, really senior experienced people who knew, hang on a minute, bringing politics into business has never, ever been a good idea. Why would it suddenly be a good idea in 2020?
And that is, unfortunately, we're talking about a phenomenon here, Tanya, that has real life consequences in the sense of degrading social relations, weakening our social infrastructure, trust in our institutions and our businesses. I mean, the cost of going along with this is so high that what is our implicit message? Because this cost is so high, it will take individual humans, individual companies, individual institutions to be taking a stand against the zombie hordes. That is what we're saying. So if we're going to say, yes, but we need to understand that it was difficult, that they were pushed into we're already, maybe it conveys understanding from our side, and it does. I know it's not easy.
They're not crazy, these people, either. Those decisions were calculated because those senior guys, people like Paul, were never into this stuff. They were never ideologically into it.
It takes a person of integrity to be standing against bad ideas. That is why we have the real prophets of the past who were pelted with stones for standing up against bad ideas, only later to be reckoned with and to be regarded as the prophet who spoke the truth after all. while everyone else was going along with this tide. It will take people. You and I have spoken about this also. Sometimes you need to take temporary losses for eventual gains or for superior moral values. You need to stand by certain principles.
But I think in the hysteria of 2020, you think they could have withstood that? Do you know what was actually, it was actually easy for smaller businesses to stand firm, which actually I know the sort of people who come to my events now are the people who actually did stand firm and never got into this stuff. I think the bigger brands, there are so many people involved in those decisions. And if you're the only person pushing against it, going, no, guys, this is a bad idea, you're going to get swept along by it.
And now more and more people realize this is a bad idea. And who can say, we're vindicated?
Yeah.
Very few.
So when we think about those conversations should have been happening openly. I suspect they were happening privately. I suspect people who were senior enough and experienced enough were ringing each other and saying, are you doing the black square thing? What's going on with this? But I think we really suffered because those conversations were not public. So there was nobody covering this. And I think there was no space for this to be discussed. Why would there be? Who should create that space? I would say the CIPD should create that space. That's exactly what an HR industry body would be for, would it not? I would think their priority should have been create space, have these conversations, find a way to make it work. I know it's a hot button issue, but they should have found a way to do it. I actually think also, and I talked to Neil Morrison, who's the HR director at Severn Trent, who's very much a friend of this podcast and also a friend of This Is Working, my new business network. He's been great. You know, I'm a huge fan of Neil's, but I went back through one of my old interviews with him from the end of 2024, and I asked him why there hadn't been more discussion from people like him. He's a very sensible guy. He's a very good guy, bags of integrity. Why he wasn't speaking out about some of this stuff at the time. And he frankly said, and this is a completely fair point.
If you're asking me where my primary focus is my primary focus going to be to try and tone down the loud voices on DE&I that I disagree with in both extremes? Or is my focus going to be creating a better organisation for the 10,000 people that we employ? It's a really, really clear answer.
So he was saying they are not individually responsible for the state of the industry or for what's going on within other organisations. And again, that's a fair point, which again...
So who's responsible?
Exactly, who is responsible? And it has to come back to the CIPD. It has to.
Well, it will take individuals speaking out. I mean, I'm speaking from my own perspective now, as someone who's been, right from the beginning, vehemently opposed against identity politics, especially in this massive industry of mental health. And I've been a target of smearing and slander, not only in South Africa, but also here in Ireland. I mean, that is the type of cost you should be willing to pay for speaking what you believe to be true and sensible and speaking out. And you know what's so interesting? As soon as one person starts showing courage, it's like a bit of a wildfire. It sort of kindles the embers, and more people start taking the stand against what is obviously deteriorating ideology. And that should have happened. It should happen now, despite threats of mob justice. It should happen now. People should take a stand against bad ideas. Our society will not survive this if people don't do it.
And I think even if there are people like Neil who want to speak out, and, you know, he does come to my events and does speak on panels, as are more and more HR people, which is great. But I think, you know, one of the reasons why he can do that is because he's also, just by a quirk of how Severn Trent, his employer, is set up, he's also the head of press, which is really unusual. Why would the head of press be also head of HR? It doesn't really make any sense. He happens to have that experience, so he does both. It's really, really unusual. Usually there's the press department is part of marketing, and the marketing director will say, we don't say controversial things in public, including saying controversial things at HR conferences. They're not incentivized to have freewheeling, let's go anywhere with this, let's say what we think kind of conversations. And there was this fear of cancellation, which everybody has been living through as well. So you make one little comment at a conference and that's going to be clipped and it goes everywhere.
I get that, but private conversations also happen.
Yeah, but that wasn't enough. I don't think private conversations were enough. It needed to be public. I don't know what the point of having a HR industry body is for your or I mean any professional body in any profession. What is the point of having it if they're not facilitating these
They
conversations?
dropped the ball. They dropped the ball.
They dropped the ball. Their conferences became just basically an opportunity for them to flog advertising space and HR to providers of HR related services. And so people on the stage are mainly paying to be on the stage so they can flog you their stuff. Where is the discussion? Where is the have we gone wrong with DEI? Do we need to reset this discussion? That was a discussion that needed to be happening. It didn't happen. So, we're in a mess now. And again, I'm the only person talking about this, which actually raises another point, this is going to sound really bad now, but I was going to launch this platform anyway. I've been moving towards it for a really long time. I've run 3 events recently under the banner This Is Working. And those are live events with panels with HR directors and other quite senior business people. That's been going really, really well. But people from all sorts of people really want to come to those events and weren't able to make it. So I'm going to create an online platform now. That's the next thing. So there'll be more news about this. Today is not the day to be selling my new platform. I'm aware of that. But I think what we've highlighted, what this case really highlights, is that there has not been enough discussion. And I do actually think now that I think there is appetite for it. I think it needs to be done in a very controlled way. So maybe it's more anonymous people, submitting articles, for example. That could be, there were solutions around this sort of stuff. But I see such a massive failure within HR, and I'm not sure whether HR is looking scared enough. Frankly, if an industry that wants to save itself should be really panicking by now and should be talking about all the stuff that's gone wrong here. And I don't see it. What I still see is hiding from the truth, still in the echo chamber. So I think what will happen is that the business world will shrink HR and move on without them, because the businesses are that ruthless. Like you say, they are that ruthless. But the universities, I think, are in a complete mess. The public sector's in a mess.
Oh, yeah. No, universities are a complete mess.
The charity sector.
Oh, yeah.
But so this story about Jason Arday, I think Cambridge are responsible for a huge amount here that's gone wrong. Mm-hmm. But I don't want to make it sound like Cambridge are the only people who have made this mistake. There is a reason why we have this phrase DEI hire, and it's because people are in a lot of roles, in a lot of industries, who should not be there. That phrase works because it rings true, because it is true that there are people in positions who shouldn't be there. So to put it all onto Cambridge, there's going to be an inquiry into Cambridge. Well, okay, great, that would be interesting. I want to see if that.
No,
but it's not going to fix. We've got an awful lot of people who are in really senior roles all over the place who shouldn't be. It doesn't fix them, does it? It's everywhere.
There's going to be a tap on the wrist. I mean, that is how universities work. Let me tell you, how louder should we shout for institutions to pay attention? How much louder should the clamoring rise until these institutions pay attention? So this amplification is, again, a very understandable psychological process. When you keep pointing out these academic institutions are corrupt. They are madrasas for bad ideas, for radicalization. People exit these universities. They're not adequately trained, especially in sociology, especially in the human sciences. It's a train wreck. It's like it's so sordid. I can't emphasize this enough. And then when an opportunity presents itself where you think, this is just the scoop we need to point this out. So did the media take it too far? I don't think so. Back in South Africa, we had a problem of rhino poaching. Tragic, horrible. And they discovered that there were organized syndicates involved in rhino poaching. Consensus. It's an immoral network, immoral operation. And I remember there was a veterinary surgeon in one of the provinces who was secretly involved in rhino poaching, and he got exposed. The expose was so scandalous, and the collective shame on someone like that who embodied betrayal was so heavy that the man ended his own life. And sometimes in society, we get these cases where a person embodies everything that has gone wrong. And sadly, it was this characterologically weak person. He was psychologically weak, but he was also morally weak. You know, even the opportunities to redeem himself, to come clean, he opposed. He called the Met, the Met police, on one of the journalists who wanted to investigate some of his statements. I mean, it's obvious that he wholeheartedly participated in his own decline. You see, several things can be true simultaneously. A person fully participating in something that is utterly immoral, as well as different systems facilitating that kind of participation. So there's no single culprit in this sordid affair. No single culprit. There are multiple culprits. Right from Hillary Kremen to Cambridge, to the academic institutions universe as it exists today, to the man himself, to these vile politicians who continue to intimidate by threatening people with mob justice should they expose a cheating person of color ever in future. Those are all culprits to a very, very bad affair.
And McKinsey and the CIPD.
Of course. We're talking about HR after all.
I have to get my own two in there. Well, let's hope we see a bit more reflection. Was there anything else that you wanted to add?
Maybe this. I said it in the past. We're heading for a rough ride, and the ride's getting rougher. I don't know if you've noticed. Yeah. The ride is getting. We're heading for even a rougher ride. Correction is going to be messy and in many ways super destructive. Cherish your friends, cherish your family, be close to people who love you, know yourself very well and stick to your principles. You will need it. We're heading for a rough ride.
Yeah. Do you think there's I see a political cultural social storm on the horizon? I think you and I both see the same thing. I mean, all I can do is try to give employers a space where they can talk about this stuff. So that's what I'm focusing on, because I think we're in some of this mess because there wasn't any space for them to do that. That's all I can do. I can't fix all the problems that we've had,
but you're facilitating new networks being built, and those employers and businesses will benefit from those networks, those novel networks being established. Very good. Very good.
All right. Well, let's hope we can add something positive into what's going to be rather a messy scene for the future. I hadn't intended to get you back on the podcast quite so soon. It was only in, I think, February that we spoke. But since everything's all kicked off, I have a feeling you might be a regular returning guest, depending on what we can see on the horizon. So thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll do it again.